Hello there, my spookies. Enrique Couto here, your host and narrator. And you know the time of year. The air is colder, the pumpkins are glowing, and the world feels just a little more haunted. As part of our spooky season celebration, I wanted to share something truly fascinating. A show that explores the dark corners where folklore meets fear. It's called Urban Legends with Luc Morjou, and in this episode, Luc dives into one of the most unsettling moral frenzies of the 20th century, the Satanic Panic. He unearths the stories, the hysteria, and the strange mix of fear and politics that turned rumor into terror and left scars that still shape conspiracies to this day. So sit back, relax, enjoy Luc's show, and afterward, search up Urban Legends with Luc Morjou on your favorite podcasting app, and tell him WeeklySpooky sent ya.
In 1962, the small Puritan settlement of Salem, Massachusetts, became the stage for one of history's most infamous moral panics. It began with a handful of young girls reportedly suffering with unexplained fits and visions of specters, eventually claiming to be being tormented by witches. Physicians found no medical cause for what was happening, and so he declared the affliction must have been the work of the devil. Ministers began to warn that Satan was moving among them, and the colony's leaders quickly decided the threat had to be rooted out. Within weeks, the accusation spread beyond the first household and into the entire community. Neighbors who had once worshipped together every Sunday were now beginning to denounce one another as old resentments over land, inheritance, and church politics surfaced as proof of a secret evil. The colonial courts relied heavily on spectral evidence, testimony that a person's spirit or shape had appeared in a dream or vision, a standard that required no physical proof. Under intense pressure and the threat of execution, suspects began to confess whether they were guilty or not, sometimes even implicating others along with it, feeding a cycle that seemed unstoppable. By the time the panic subsided in 1693, more than 200 people had been accused, with 20 of them being executed. Others managed to survive, but were confined to jail. Historians now see Salem as a textbook study of collective hysteria. Economic uncertainty, political instability, and the rigid Puritan worldview had all primed the population to see the devil's hand in everyday misfortune. The trials revealed to humanity just how quickly fear can override reason, and how easily suggestion and coercion can create memories. Although it is a lesson that we've never truly accepted. Centuries have passed, but the pattern it demonstrates never disappeared. In the 20th century, the supposed signs had changed, as people no longer worried about whispered spells. Instead, their focus was drawn to the strange sounds of heavy metal lyrics and fantasy games being shared amongst the youth. In fact, the newly placed authority figures, such as police officers and specialist therapists, continued to repeat the exact same mistakes Salem's magistrates had consistently made by believing first and investigating later. My name is Luc Morjou, and this urban legend is the Satanic Panic. The Church of Satan began in San Francisco on Van Pulkesnacht, 30th of April, 1966, when former carnival organist and police photographer Anton LaVey shaved his head, donned a black robe, and declared the founding of a new religion. Although, it is worth noting that his Satan was not meant to be the horned demon of Christian law. Anton had reassigned the devil as a symbol of rebellion, indulgence, and individual freedom, acting instead as a theatrical rejection of both Christian morality and bland conformity. Members gathered in their now infamous Black House that sat on California Street. Here, they performed elaborate, incense-filled rituals that borrowed Catholic imagery and occult aesthetics. However, this was always for the sake of theatrics and drama, rather than any real worship taking place. A few years later, in 1969, Anton published the Satanic Bible, laying out a philosophy that prized reason, self-interest, and ritual as mere performance. It was part philosophy, part provocation, spreading quickly through underground presses. Anton wanted to shock and horrify a nation already uneasy with counterculture, and it worked spectacularly. To an already anxious public, the word Satan was enough, and newspapers painted Anton LaVey's congregation as a genuine cult of devil worshippers. People were outraged. Evangelical preachers began to warn that the devil was recruiting, and by the 1970s, the Church of Satan's black masses and inverted crosses had been used to feed the idea that shadowy covens really were gathering in basements and forest. While the Church of Satan preached symbolism, the legend of very real devil worshippers was already taking root. This strange time of history may not present itself as a single, neat legend like we usually cover, but in many ways, the Satanic Panic was built on a wide web of them instead. Stories of hidden covens, black-robed kidnappers, and ritual sacrifice spread through neighborhoods, schools, and late-night news broadcasts for years. Each tale, no matter how outrageous, was treated as a warning, much like the folkloric stories of old. And just like many urban legends that surround them, they were widely believed, blurring what was mere storytelling and what was truly happening. In my telling of a fictional encounter set in the horrors of the Satanic Panic, we will follow Tevin on his way to meet a new group of friends in the autumn of 1992. The night air carried the damp smell of rain-soaked leaves, filling Tevin's lungs with a freshness that can only be found after a storm. The skies were clear for the first time in weeks, allowing the moonlight to proudly glow down upon the long, dark streets once again. This October didn't feel as cold as he previously remembered, which was just as well considering he'd only stepped out in a thin jacket and a t-shirt, too busy trying to find batteries for his torch before rushing out the door. It had been weeks since he had hung out with his friends, and he didn't want to be late. He wasn't sure what had happened between them. When he left for California to spend the summer with his mum, he was surprised to find that James, Mary, and Molly had thrown him a little party, just for the four of them. They were sad to see him go, and excited to hear his stories when they got back. His dad had always been distant and cold, and his mum had moved across the country to live with another family. And so in many ways, these three who he had grown up with were his true family. Separately, none of them fitted in amongst society. In fact, to most, they were downright strange. But together, they had an understanding. He always felt invisible when they weren't around. And so, much of his time in California had been lonely and troublesome. He arrived back in Virginia just in time for the beginning of the school year, and he was so keen to get back to his friends. Although, when he finally saw them, their attitudes towards him had completely changed. They seemed quieter than before, more distant and aloof towards school and sports. None of them did much gaming outside of role-playing even before he left, but they at least enjoyed the chance to throw balls at students that had given them shit in the past during dodgeball. Now, they avoided interacting with people altogether, including him. It was them against the world, always together, always whispering about things that instantly halted the moment he would walk over. He was worried about them, but he didn't know what to say. How was he supposed to ask his friends why they're being weird now, especially with how insecure and left out he was feeling about the whole situation? He missed his friends and desperately wanted to be included once again. It wasn't as if he had a pick of friends at school, with many finding the four of them weird long before the strange change of summer. That's why he jumped so enthusiastically at the chance to meet them when they finally called him up for a new adventure. Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't feel so invisible anymore. Out in the woods, they had apparently come across an old, abandoned building, one that used to serve as a small factory or office space. They didn't know for sure what it was, but what they did know was that nobody had been there for many years and that much of its foundations was still in place. It would be the perfect place to hang out, somewhere where they could be free from the rest of society. Tevin drew closer to the trees ahead, already feeling the darkness grow as the residential houses behind got further with every step. This was where they were supposed to meet. At least, he hoped it was the place they meant. The entrance to the woods by Mary's old house. This is the corner they would meet up at and ride their bikes through town as kids. And although it was far more overgrown than it used to be, little else had changed. He clicked on his torch and shone it into the trees, hoping to see them nearby waiting, but he saw nothing but the dancing shadows of the leaves in the gentle breeze. There was no way he was going to step in there by himself. He had watched far too many horror films for those kind of antics. Well, that was until a greater fear took over. The fear of getting caught. He sharply spun on the spot as the porch light of a nearby house flicked on, filling the area in a golden glow. By the time the owner stepped out with his dog in hand, Tevin had vanished, disappearing into the trees to avoid being seen. If their new spot had been taken away before they even got there due to him being sighted, they'd likely never speak to him again. He crept deeper into the trees, covering his torch with the palm of his hand, turning its bright light to a soft pink as he pointed it to the ground. He sat quietly, watching the man slowly wander up the street, his dog seemingly sniffing every blade of grass it passed as it slowly followed behind. Once the coast was clear, he turned to look deeper into the trees once again, although this time he just about jumped out of his skin. Standing in the dark amongst the trees were his three friends, Molly, Mary, and James, all watching him with excitable smiles on their faces. "Good to see you dressed to blend in," James remarked, alluding to the bright blue jacket Tevin had on compared to the black hoodies they had hanging off their shoulders. Tevin stuttered, feeling far more anxious than he'd expected to feel, already worried that he'd messed it up. Luckily, Molly broke the ice by skipping forward and grabbing his arm with energetic glee. "He's kidding," she exclaimed, pulling him deeper into the trees. "It's really good to see you." Tevin smiled with a deep exhale, feeling relieved to see the silly, playful Molly he had missed for so long. "How far away is it?" he asked, stretching out his free hand to calm his nerves, forcing himself to remember that he was safe and amongst friends. "Not far," James replied, but before he could add anything to it, Mary began pacing into the trees with impatience, loudly demanding that they get a move on. They laughed it off together, venturing deeper into the woods than they had ever been before. As kids, they were always too afraid to go inside, and by the time they got older and braver, Mary had moved, giving them no reason to ever be on this side of town. It wasn't as if there was much excitement for them to have found, though, surrounded by nothing but trees, shrubberies, and moss. The group caught up with each other, each of the three taking it in turns to ask Tevin questions about his trip, avoiding any real answers to anything he may have asked them. He didn't mind, though. He'd been wanting to tell them about California since before he'd even got back, and was happy that he was finally able to update them all with it. That was until Mary began questioning him about girls, causing the group to laugh and giggle amongst themselves as they teased him about being a virgin. "Finally lost your V-card?" she asked, directing her torch directly into his face, quite literally putting him in the spotlight, just in time to see his cheeks blush rosy red as his eyes darted around him. But it was then, as he looked out into the trees to avoid their questions, that he spotted what looked to be an old man peering around the bark of the tree, watching them as they walked. He paused on the spot, flinging his torch towards it with a yelp, causing the entire group to stop with him. "What are you doing?" Molly called out, frustrated by his loudness. Tevin studied the shadows, darting his torchlight to every corner he could see, although the old man was nowhere to be seen. "I swear I just saw someone," he whispered to ensure whoever it was didn't hear. Although this was a pointless act, as James laughed, shouting, "Oh, Tevin's seeing ghosts now." With that, he carried on walking, refusing to engage with any of it. "I'm serious," Tevin replied, his eyes still studying the trees around him. "It's probably just a shadow," Molly announced, swinging her arm around as she forced him to step forward. "Don't think you're getting out of telling us about girls, you naughty boy," Mary added, putting her arm around his waist as she pulled him forward until they were all walking after James once again. "There were no girls," Tevin sheepishly admitted, his mind quickly drifting away from the face he had seen amongst the shadows. The girls squeezed him tightly, telling him that they love that he's still a virgin, and that they think he should keep his innocence forever. With this, they stepped out onto a clearing for the first time since they had entered the trees, revealing a tall but thin building. It was made of old brown brick, with several of the windows blown out and crumbling on the floor below. Although, all things considered, it looked fairly well kept, with several floors rising up onto the trees. "What's the view like up there?" Tevin asked as he admired it, now joining them in the excitement of a new place to hang out. "Oh, it's great in the day, but I want to show you something else," Molly told him, grabbing his hand and instantly dragging him towards the entrance. "Wait, don't rush," James called out, seemingly frustrated that she had taken the lead at the last minute. Tevin stepped into the main room as Molly jumped ahead, placing her torch against the windowsill, pointing it up at the ceiling so it served as a lamp, bouncing off the white-painted ceiling above. She turned to him with a smile, widening her arms to proudly show off the space. It was cool. There was no denying that. But at the same time, Tevin became all the more aware just how dangerous this was now he was inside. It seemed sturdy enough in most places, although a large gaping hole spread over what used to be the ceiling of the hallway up ahead, with beams of wood and sheets of rubble scattered across the floor. "What'd you think?" James asked as he remained in the doorway, Mary hovering in the shadow behind him. "Yeah, it's really cool," Tevin replied, keeping a brave face as he nervously studied the ceiling for any cracks that could somehow cave in any minute. "This isn't even the coolest part," James replied with a confident smile, turning his head to a doorway on the other side of the room. Molly, in her excitement, darted forward once again, flinging it open before Tevin could even register what was happening. Inside was nothing but darkness, even when Tevin lifted his torch, as if the black itself was too thick. "Go check it out," Molly demanded, struggling to keep her enthusiastic smile at bay. Tevin instead stepped back away from it, shaking his head as he did. "No way." To that, Molly sighed with frustration, turning to James and Mary as if asking them what to do. "Oh, come on, we'll all go down. Molly, you first," Mary announced to the room as she barged inside. Molly didn't move, widening her eyes as she stared back at her, clearly not wanting to be the first to enter. Tevin was quickly growing uneasy. They were acting stranger than usual. "Fine," Molly replied with another smile, although this time through gritted teeth. "But only if you come with me," she added, reaching a hand out to Tevin. He could never say no to Molly. He had always held a soft spot for her. And so, without much thought at all, he took her hand and allowed her to lead him into the darkness. The moment he stepped through the doorway, he realized that it was a set of stairs, heavily creaking under every step they took, delving deeper into the basement. "Is this safe?" he asked, peeking over his shoulder to look back up at the security he was leaving behind. Now, James and Mary had moved, standing in the doorway, blocking anyone from coming in or out as they watched him go deeper. He was partly frightened, but mostly confused, unsure on what to do or say, and so he just continued to follow Molly's lead, venturing deeper into the dark. That is when Tevin knew that he had made a grave mistake. Now he could see into the basement he was being led to, and what he found was not the darkness he had expected. Instead, he witnessed dozens of candles flickering around the room, symbols scattered in chalk across the walls, with one large, circular one engraved in the dirt below. In the middle of the room was a wide wooden table, clean and strong, with leather straps wrapped around each leg, draped on the table, ready for use. This was a sight that frightened and horrified him, and yet it was nothing compared to the realization that they were not as alone as he had first thought. Standing in different corners of the room were several figures, people cloaked in black robes, patiently waiting for his arrival. Tevin didn't scream, nor did he try to run. He just stood there, heartbroken by the way in which his friends had tricked him. He turned to look back up the stairs to find Mary and James were still standing in the doorway, simply watching him with blank expressions on their faces. Behind them was now the same face Tevin had seen in the trees, standing behind them in his large, blood-red cloak, a smile clear on his face. Tevin jumped back against the wall as the hooded figures that surrounded him drew closer, muttering strange incantations under their breath in unison. He turned to Molly, hoping that she would tell him that it was just a prank, but instead, she watched him back with a reassuring smile, nodding her head as if thanking him. He wanted to say so much. He wanted to ask so many questions, but instead, all that came out of his mouth was her name, repeated several times as they grabbed his arms. He fought back as hard as he could, but there was no way he could fight off the two lumbering men who stood either side of him, and so he was forced to watch as the rest slowly began to form a circle around Molly. She watched them with a confused expression, her eyes darting to each of them as she tried to step away. It became clear very fast that this was not part of the plan as she knew it. Tevin watched as James and Mary slowly made their way down the stairs, followed by the old man whose smile seemed to grow with every step closer that he took. The room filled with Molly's screams as James and Mary joined the others, lifting her up and placing her on the table, strapping her arms and legs to it with the lever. The two men, either side of Tevin, escorted him to a chair in the corner of the room before placing their hands on his shoulders, forcing him to take a seat. He wasn't fighting back anymore. His mind now frozen still as he watched the horrors unfold across the room. Molly's cries continued, switching between threats and pleas with every breath. But none reacted. The old man, who had now reached the floor, ignored her also. His eyes fixated on Tevin's as he edged closer, his smile growing wider with every step that he took. Slowly, the man crouched down in front of him, his sharp blue eyes fixated on Tevin's as his smile changed once again, although this one only confused Tevin further. Now, he looked almost caring, gently reaching out and placing his hand on the side of Tevin's face. He leaned forward, gently placing his lips on Tevin's forehead for a moment before pulling away. A strangely tender moment amongst the horrified screams that swirled around the room. Tevin's eyes filled with tears as he watched the old man study him one last time before getting to his feet. And then finally, he spoke. "You don't need to feel alone anymore," he said, lifting a strange, curved dagger in his hand. Tevin's eyes widened in horror as he watched the sharp blade edge closer to him. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the final blow to come. But then, instead, the two men either side of him let go. The old man was not holding the dagger to use. He was offering it to him. "You have a family here, if you want it," he added, as Tevin reached out to take the dagger from him. He rose to his feet as the man edged closer to the table. Molly, who had now spotted Tevin holding the dagger, began to panic further, begging him to help her. The hooded figures had now parted ways, gathering on one side of the table, creating a gap for Tevin to approach without obstruction. James and Mary stood by Molly's feet, their hoods now above their heads as they watched him, their eyes beaming with excitement and pride. Tevin arrived at the table, looking down at Molly's vulnerable body that lay strapped to the wood. She no longer screamed or pleaded. She watched him as he contemplated what to do, her eyes filling with tears. Tevin gripped the dagger tightly. He could turn and run, but they would catch him. He could swing that dagger and take out as many as he could before leaving. He had a weapon after all, and it didn't look as though any of them did. However, there was something else in his mind that both excited and terrified him. The words the old man had said had appealed to him in a way that he had not expected. This was made all the worse when he added, "We see you, Tevin." He gently placed his hand on Tevin's shoulder, once again giving him a reassuring smile. "He sees you." Tevin turned to his friends, who both watched him with pride. Mary nodded her head encouragingly, whilst James waited for his decision. He didn't look back at Molly. He didn't want to anymore. She was luring him into a trap, or at least, she thought she was. So why should he care? What could she possibly say that could change anything? He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't invisible. In the spring of 2001, British journalist John Ronson released a book titled Them, Adventures with Extremists. In this book, he chronicled his encounters with conspiracy theorists, militia leaders, and secret societies across the world. What he uncovered wasn't just fringe eccentricities. It was those who had given into the impulse to split the world into insiders and outsiders, with the comforting and safe us and the untrustworthy and threatening them. Psychologists refer to this as in-group, out-group bias, a reflex that makes unfamiliar ideas or communities feel dangerous to us. That instinct, which was so vividly captured in Ronson's brilliant reporting, is what sets the stage for the dark and strange time of the Satanic Panic. In the United States, the late 1970s and early 1980s were marked by Cold War anxieties, a sharp economic recession, and the rise of family values movements that promised to restore a Christian social order, with evangelical leaders such as Jerry Falwell and Pat Robinson warning that secularism, feminism, and new religious movements threatened the nation's soul. This climate of cultural backlash primed churches, local politicians, and law enforcement agencies to treat any whisper of occult activity as evidence of a deeper moral decay. Insider bias is a core element of nationalism, and we see it repeated time and time again over history. Even today, certain groups fixate on those they consider them, demonizing their very existence to justify their internalized anger, serving as a scapegoat when the need arises. And one thing that we've seen over the years amongst countries with notable sample sizes of Christian theologians is that labeling the outsiders as demonic becomes a well-worn and successful tactic. It was in the 12th century that Christians began accusing Jews of using the blood of kidnapped Christian children in secret rituals, an invention that fused religious prejudice with fears of the occult. This belief reached a gruesome crescendo in 1475 with the Simon of Trent blood libel. Here, the body of a 2-year-old named Simon was found in a ditch in the city of Trento, Italy, leading local officials to quickly blame the Jewish community. Authorities arrested nearly every Jewish resident, subjecting them to brutal torture until they produced the confessions investigators demanded. In the end, 15 Jewish men were executed, whilst the women and children were forced to convert or expelled as the entire Jewish quarter was destroyed. The child was declared a martyr and eventually venerated as Blessed Simon of Trent. Pilgrims flocked to his shrine, and lurid woodcuts depicted Jews committing ritual murder, spreading the myth across Europe as fact. It wasn't until Pope Sixtus IV eventually ordered an inquiry that doubt was cast on the charges, although by now, the damage proved to be irreversible. The blood libel had been reprinted in pamphlets and sermons from Germany to Poland, feeding the hatred and demonization for generations. This entrenched a template for anti-Semitic violence that has persisted into modern times, inspiring later outbreaks in places like Prague, Kiev, and beyond. The myth of Jews murdering Christian children for ritual purposes never truly disappeared. It just mutated, resurfacing in different guises well into the 20th century, even still found in many contemporary conspiracy theories. Episodes like the Simon of Trent libel also helped entrench the habit of scapegoating outsiders whenever societies felt destabilized. These narratives fed later witch hunt mentalities, linking fears of heresy to cosmic evil and offering a template for communities to turn ordinary neighbors into existential threats. Then, There's the witch trials during the 15th century, where Europeans tortured and executed many innocent people, reportedly in the tens of thousands, with the intention of ending demonic connections and witchcraft amongst the accused. This was very much embedded into European culture as they continued to spread across the West, and soon enough, the Americas were filled with demonic claims with it, leading to the infamous cases of Salem. In 1927, Herbert Gorman released a novel titled The Place Called Dagon, which follows the story of devil worshippers that derived from Salem. The book was purely fictional, of course. However, it was considered to be radical and influential at the time, with historian Philip Jenkins claiming that it would actually become a key influence on the Satanic Panic that would come decades later. By the 20th century, US child protection laws and mandatory reporting requirements, which were designed to safeguard children, unintentionally created powerful incentives to investigate even the thinnest of allegations. Federal grants rewarded aggressive pursuit of child abuse claims, and social work training often emphasized believe the child, making it difficult for investigators to pause when stories grew fantastical. The USA at the time had gotten very comfortable with its unmoving sense of religion, family dynamics, and expectations. But as culture progressed and expanded, these systems began to look different in several places across the continent. And as we've learned over the years, there are a large number of people who despise this change. New religious movements had appeared, family dynamics were diversifying, and media began to delve deeper into taboo subjects, most notably ones that delved into the themes of the occult. By the 1930s, satanic cults had become part of pulp fiction, being consumed by millions over the years. By the 1960s, some who had grown up during the times of these stories were now working as huge Hollywood directors, creating films such as Rosemary's Baby of 1968, The Exorcist of 1973, and The Omen of 1976. Beyond this, people had begun to see signs of not quite the same, but unnervingly similar events taking place in the real world, such as the horrifying murders committed by the Manson family in 1969. This, along with several other factors, such as Anton LaVey's theatrical antagonistic antics, cemented worldwide associations between cults and violence in public imagination. And by the end of the 1970s, the ingredients for a moral panic had begun to mix, slowly forming in the quiet, anxious parts of society. Evangelical communities, who were already wary of the way the world was going, found further justification in their fears when Mike Warnke published his 1972 memoir, The Satan Seller, which falsely claimed he had led a 1,500-member satanic group that engaged in human sacrifice and other horrors. The book was treated as expert testimony in the churches and Christian media, and Warnke parlayed it into a lucrative career as an occult expert, even briefing police. Only in the early 1990s did Cornerstone magazine's long investigation comprehensively debunk his story. Before that, though, things had gotten far worse before they were ever going to get better, with the 1980s publication of Michelle Remembers, a discredited memoir co-authored by psychiatrist Lawrence Pasda and his patient, the titular Michelle Smith. The book presented lurid, recovered childhood memories of satanic ritual abuse, uncovered in more than 600 hours of hypnosis, complete with an 81-day ritual, angelic visitations, and infant sacrifice. None of it could be corroborated by investigators or local records, but nonetheless, it sold briskly, putting Pasda on television and conference stages. giving police, prosecutors, and therapists a ready-made narrative template. At the center of this all was the misguided adoption of recovered memory therapy, or RMT, which purported to uncover repressed memories of childhood trauma through techniques like hypnosis and guided imagery. Many of those doing this were operating from a Christian worldview, which meant dissociative symptoms such as mood swings or identity fragmentation were sometimes interpreted as signs of satanic ritual abuse. In peer-reviewed and professional outlets at the time, clinicians treating multiple personality disorder, as DID was then known, report large proportions of patients recovering satanic ritual abuse accounts that later proved impossible to verify. Others warned that suggestibility and leading interviews by authorities were inadvertently turning therapy rooms into story factories, conjuring up the tales the authorities wanted to hear. It was on the 25th of October 1988 that NBC aired Devil Worship: Exposing Satan's Underground, a 2-hour primetime special hosted by Geraldo Rivera, reaching roughly 19.8 million households. The program stitched together horrific anecdotes, supposed expert sound bites, and several interviews with self-proclaimed Satanists. Rivera told viewers there were around 1 million Satanists in the United States alone, operating through a secretive network. This show horrified audiences, accelerating already placed anxieties. But what many weren't aware of at the time was that this special, presented as investigative journalism, relied almost entirely on unverified testimony and sensational claims. Newspapers and magazines jumped on the hype next, further sensationalizing the panic by repeating the claims with minimal due diligence. Segments of the religious press amplified them further, as evangelical outlets and bookstores platformed wonky and similar survivor narratives for years. On top of that, local press began to run police warnings about supposed occult crime waves taking place. This merged the lurid with the legitimate and created a trapdoor for skepticism, as if you were to push back on the urban legends being spread, you'd be seen as somebody who doesn't care about the victims of child abuse. Sensationalism was not confined to television. Tabloids such as the National Enquirer got involved, hungry for circulation spikes, and radio hosts booked self-described occult experts to appear on the air, keeping alleged satanic crime in the headlines week after week and turning local rumors into national talking points. None of this, though, quite summed up the sheer panic of this time, like the McMartin preschool trials that span from 1983 to 1990. It began in Manhattan Beach, California, when mother Judy Johnson told police her preschool-aged son had been abused by a young teacher, Ray Buckey. Police went on to send around 200 letters to families, urging them to question their children about sexual abuse, listing specific acts to ask about. The police chief wrote, "The following procedure is obviously an unpleasant one, but to protect the rights of your children as well as the rights of the accused, this inquiry is necessary. And please question your child to see if he or she has been witness to any crime, or if she has been a victim." Psychologists looking back at this have considered this letter a perfect example of what not to do in this situation. But it went ahead regardless. Hundreds of children were then interviewed at Children's Institute International by social worker Key McFarlane's team using techniques later criticized as highly suggestive, such as repeated sessions, heavy adult talk, anatomically detailed dolls, and encouragement to pretend or remember. Within months, the allegations had ballooned far beyond their original interpretations, now filled with claims of secret tunnels, animal sacrifice, naked movie star games, and even celebrity involvement. This caused a frenzy amongst believers, and it horrified citizens up and down the country. Soon enough, excavations had begun under the school, where they did turn up old debris of earlier buildings. However, they found no secret chamber inside. On top of that, the taped interviews with the children, when eventually played to jurors, showed the degree of leading and pressure, quickly becoming decisive to those in the courtroom. After an 18-month preliminary hearing, multiple defendants faced hundreds of counts. But eventually, all were acquitted or left with hung juries, with the last charges dismissed in 1990. Although the McMartin case was far from unique. In New Jersey, Kelly Michaels, a young daycare worker in 1993, was convicted after a trial built solely on interviews, ones that were so coercive that experts later called them textbook examples of how to create false memories. Her conviction was overturned on appeal. In North Carolina, the Little Rascals daycare prosecution became a drawn-out ordeal that consumed most of a decade for those involved. What began in 1989 as a single parent's vague worry quickly escalated after investigators used highly suggestive interviews with the children. Soon, more than 20 youngsters were recounting lurid scenes of satanic ceremonies, secret boat rides, and impossible acts of violence. 7 staff members in total, including owner Bob Kelly and cook Dawn Wilson, were charged with hundreds of counts of abuse. The trial stretched on for 7 exhausting years, marked by sensational headlines and televised testimony. There was never any physical evidence, yet some defendants spent years in jail awaiting verdicts while the community split into bitter factions. The McMartin investigation itself ended up being the longest and most expensive criminal prosecution in American history at the time, and left the accused bankrupt and stigmatized, the children traumatized by the process, and the public no closer to evidence of a satanic conspiracy. By now, though, the case was a national spectacle, and the hunt for the Satanists was continued, even as more and more people began to question the legitimacy of their very existence. The stories in some cases had grown too outlandish for even the most susceptible of audiences, including tales of a goat man who would later become an urban legend of their own. On top of that, tales of school employees having the ability to fly or cause bodily harm without leaving a mark caused many to reconsider the legitimacy of these tales. In May 1985, the news program 2020 ran a segment on Satan worship too, regurgitating many of the theatrical supposed facts that were spreading across the continent. Now, there were a couple of caveats to this, as the host, Hugh Downs, did open the show by saying, "Police have been skeptical when investigating these acts, just as we are in reporting them. But there is no question that something is going on out there, and that's sufficient reason for 2020 to look into it." However, it was only at the end that he stated, "The link between crime and satanic cults will remain speculative." The problem with this, of course, is that by now, the audience has sat and watched a full narrative displayed as fact. So by the time this disclaimer is said, viewers are already emotionally enthralled, disgusted, and horrified by the concept. This in itself serves as a leading question, which is a tactic still used today under the guise of, "I'm just asking questions," By planting the seed, a belief can grow, whether it's sprouting from fact or fiction. This works in the favor of the person putting that question forward, as technically they've actually made no statement and can claim their innocence in any future time. In that sense, this part of history is repeating itself again. It's only the boogeyman himself that has changed. Eventually, law enforcement agencies began to institutionalize the panic through occult crime seminars, specialty officers, and training materials. And now infamous 1994 training film, Law Enforcement's Guide to Satanic Cults, circulated in departments, teaching rank-and-file officers to read everyday items and youth subcultures as red flags. Sold-out conference halls taught officers to treat heavy metal records, fantasy role-playing, and even Halloween decorations as gateways to Satanism. Parents groups and prosecutors targeted bands like Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbourne, bringing high-profile trials over alleged subliminal messages, while moral crusaders painted Dungeons and Dragons as a recruiting tool for the occult. In fact, the Recording Industry Association's Parental Advisory sticker, which was introduced in 1985, owed as much to this climate of satanic fear as any concerns regarding explicit lyrics. It was due to this mix of pop culture devils, podium experts, therapeutic fashions, and police training that a perfect feedback loop had been created, feeding on media sensationalism and public panic, and reinforced by confirmation bias. That's why, looking back, the most sobering figures remain the simplest ones. Out of thousands of allegations, no real proof of an intergenerational, organized satanic network ever surfaced. People who believed they were acting virtuously to save lives and stop evil, instead left a trail of wrecked families and shattered reputations. Ordinary teachers and caregivers were demonized and vilified, while children were pressed to remember horrors that never truly happened. And yet, of all the stories to emerge from this fevered time, one stands out above due to how dark, confusing, and troubling the case was from the beginning to the end. And that is the trial of the West Memphis Three.
If you're still listening, I know you share my passion for folklore and urban legends. But to keep these stories coming, I need your help. For just £3 a month, you can ensure the show thrives, with shorter breaks between seasons and even more content created. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive perks, including access to our bonus series, Modern Myths, giving you 8 additional episodes each season, featuring captivating tales such as The Hodag, The Dark Watchers, and many more. You'll also enjoy behind-the-scenes insights, discounts on merchandise, and access to our private community chat, where you can connect directly with me and other urban legend enthusiasts. And as an extra thank you, I randomly feature patrons in upcoming stories, so you could become part of the legends we discuss. Your support isn't just subscribing. It's joining a passionate community dedicated to keeping folklore alive. Your contribution directly fuels the research and production of this show. If you're ready to join, just click the Patreon link in our show notes to subscribe, and I'll see you there. But for now, back to the legend.
On the warm evening of May the 5th, 1993, 3 8-year-old friends, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, climbed onto their bikes and set off through the quiet streets of West Memphis, Arkansas. They were a familiar sight. Stevie leading the way, Michael keeping pace, Christopher determined not to be left behind as they pedaled towards a patch of woods the locals called Robin Hood Hills. Although, when darkness fell and the boys hadn't returned, parents began calling their names through the back gardens and vacant lots. Soon enough, police joined the search, flashlights cutting through the trees as hours passed with no sign of them. It wasn't until the following afternoon that a volunteer spotted a black tennis shoe in a muddy drainage ditch. They investigated further, hoping to find some form of evidence that could lead them to the boys' whereabouts so they could be brought to safety. However, unfortunately, what she found were the bodies of all 3 boys, laying submerged in water. They were naked, hog-tied with their own shoelaces, and their clothes found nearby, inside out and caked with mud. Stevie and Michael bore signs of blunt trauma and drowning, but Christopher Byers had additional injuries such as knife wounds and genital mutilation. There were no fingerprints, no usable DNA, and no clear weapon. West Memphis had a horrifying crime and not a single obvious suspect to question. But this was 1993, a time where America was deep in the grip of the Satanic Panic, and so whispers of an occult motive filled the void left by this lack of evidence. Because of this, police soon focused on 3 local teenagers who didn't quite fit in with the town's expectations. Damien Eccles, 18, who wore black, read about Wicca, and loved heavy metal. Jason Baldwin, 16, his quiet friend. And Jesse Miskelly Jr., 17, who was a neighbor with a mild intellectual disability. After more than 12 hours of interrogation without a parent or lawyer present, Jesse Miskelly gave a confused confession riddled with contradictions as times continuously didn't match and details consistently shifted. He recanted almost immediately, but by now it was too late, and the story had been locked onto. Over time, prosecutors wove a story of ritual murder, presenting Damien Eccles' music taste, black clothing, and interest in alternative religion as proof of satanic allegiance. The trials for their convictions began in 1994. Jesse Miskelly was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 of second-degree murder, sentenced to life plus 40 years. Whereas Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin were tried together, and with no physical evidence, the state leaned heavily on Miskelly's disputed confession and testimony from the so-called occult experts. This led to Baldwin receiving life without parole, and Eccles being sentenced to death. Damien Eccles spent 18 years on death row, but luckily, constant appeals, outside scrutiny, and later DNA testing kept any execution at bay. Beginning in the late 1990s, HBO's Paradise Lost documentaries pulled back the curtain on these trials, and the first film, from 1996, revealed glaring holes in the prosecution's story, spotlighting the 3 supposed devil worshippers as 3 alternative kids being caught up in hysteria. Its sequel, Paradise Lost 2, Revelations in 2000, and the follow-up, Paradise Lost 3, Purgatory in 2011, followed the years of the appeals put forward by the 3, who were now grown men. By now, their story had inspired a worldwide movement of musicians, activists, and legal advocates to raise money and demand a new trial. By now, it was public knowledge that modern forensic testing had found no DNA from any of the 3 defendants on the crime scene evidence. Instead, however, a hair recovered from a ligature was consistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Stevie Branch. Facing mounting public pressure and the likelihood of a new trial, the state of Arkansas offered an Alford plea in the August of 2011. This rare legal mechanism allowed the 3 men to plead guilty while maintaining their innocence. After 18 years in prison, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly walked free, still legally convicted, but no longer behind bars. The murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers remain officially unsolved. The West Memphis 3 continue to fight to clear their names, and the case endures as one of the most infamous examples of how fear, in this instance, the Satanic Panic, can shape an investigation, a courtroom, and nearly cost an innocent man his life. The Satanic Panic thrived in the broader atmosphere of the 1980s when a new culture war was taking shape and powerful voices were working to reassert traditional values against what they saw as a secular drift. To many, Satanism became the imagined endpoint of liberalism. If you didn't fit the demands placed on gender, age, viewpoint, or sexuality, you were seen as flirting with the devil. That framing was dangerous as it made suspicion a virtue and doubt a sin, asking people to choose a side first and check the facts later. This isn't unfamiliar to you, I'm sure, as modern conspiracy movements recycle these exact same plot points, only now spread faster and wider in our digital age. It was in late 2017 that QAnon began, when an anonymous poster calling themselves Q dropped cryptic posts on the message board 4chan. What stood out about them, though, was that they were claiming to have high-level US security clearance. Q, during his posts that would later be known as Q drops, began to talk of an impending showdown between Donald Trump and a secret network of child-abusing elites. Followers flocked to these drops, treating each vague post as a riddle for them to crowdsource interpretations, fusing older satanic panic myths with every strain of internet paranoia, such as global cabals, coded symbols, and apocalyptic storms of mass arrests. Within months, QAnon migrated from fringe forums to Facebook groups, YouTube channels, and mainstream social feeds. Certain influencers saw an opportunity and ran with it, labeling themselves as digital soldiers, making podcasts, live streams, and memes. The movement even borrowed legitimate anti-trafficking language, most notably the slogan, "Save the Children," forcing the actual charity of that name to publicly distance itself from a campaign it never endorsed. Official endorsement was unnecessary, though. And just like the Satanic Panic, anyone who approached the subject with suspicion was seen as naive, stupid, or downright evil. But that all being said, this is not where these stories' reemergence begun. It was actually a year prior to QAnon's beginning, back in 2016, that a rumor known as Pizzagate was being spread, laying the groundwork for much of the coming conspiracies. It began when hacked political emails from the US presidential campaign were misread and twisted on forums like Reddit and 4chan. Strangers had somehow come to the conclusion that the word pizza was code for a child trafficking ring allegedly run by prominent Democrats out of Washington, D.C. at a restaurant called Comet Ping Pong, even though there was never a shred of evidence to any of it. As we've seen time and time again, though, that didn't matter. And in that December, a man named Edgar Madison Welch drove from North Carolina to the pizzeria with an assault rifle, convinced he was on a mission to rescue children. Once there, he fired several shots before surrendering to the police. No children were ever found inside because, as you may have expected, no ring was ever found. Far from ignoring the Pizzagate scandal, QAnon had absorbed it wholesale, treating the Comet Ping Pong fantasy as early proof of its own sweeping claims. And due to this, the two movements became entwined as Pizzagate provided the script, whilst QAnon gave it a new, global stage. QAnon never did ever produce credible evidence of its grand conspiracy, but it didn't need to. Like the satanic ritual legends before it, the movement thrived on fear, symbolism, and the promise that deciphering secret signs could reveal the ultimate truth. Just as the Satanic Panic left lives in ruins without ever proving its dark claims, QAnon continues to linger in the culture, with shouts of blood harvesting, child sex rings, and deep state still prominent amongst many. Nearly 200 people were charged with crimes during the years of the Satanic Panic, and amongst them, dozens were convicted. Fortunately, many of these defendants were eventually freed, although some were incarcerated for far too many years due to misinformation and urban legend. Geraldo Rivera, whose TV show was a key component in the spread of the Satanic Panic misinformation, has even gone on to apologize for his part in it all. Even one of the former students of McMartin's school came out to openly admit what we all by now knew, that she had lied. Whilst talking to the Los Angeles Times, she was quoted as saying, "It was an ordeal. I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to get out of here unless I tell them what they want to hear." The stories, and the panic along with it, were powerful enough to jump borders. In the United Kingdom, allegations of ritual or satanic abuse surfaced in high-profile child protection action at Rochdale and Orkney, but once again, subsequent inquiries criticised interviewing methods and found no evidential basis for organised satanic crimes. Jean de La Fontaine's government-commissioned review of hundreds of British cases concluded that there was no corroborated proof that child abuse was part of rites with a religious or magical objective, even as genuine non-ritual abuse certainly existed. In Canada, the Martinsville prosecution in Saskatchewan spiraled into claims of a cult called the Brotherhood of the Ram, before a later RCMP review condemned the investigation as driven by emotional hysteria and by suggestive child interviews. Later, multiple defendants were eventually compensated for malicious prosecution. In the Netherlands, the 1987 to 1989 Oud Pekela affair prompted a Justice Ministry work group whose 1994 report judged that the satanic narrative was unlikely and instead attributed many accounts to suggestive questioning within a therapeutic network. South Africa formed an occult-related crimes unit in the early 1990s, and media carried scattered satanic ritual abuse claims. But historians note the panic never anchored itself in sustained, corroborated cases. Australia too saw waves of allegations, conferences, and bitter professional disputes about ritual abuse, with scholars later describing it as an imported moral panic rather than a phenomenon supported by material evidence. A key factor across all of these cases was a profound misunderstanding of memory. Decades of research show human memory is reconstructive. It can be actively distorted by post-event information, leading questions, repeated interviews, or discussions with peers. Elizabeth Loftus's work on the misinformation effect demonstrates how exposure to misleading cues can alter what witnesses firmly believe they recall. And with children, the risks are even higher. Classic reviews by Stephen J. Sessi, Professor of Development Psychology, and Maggie Bruck, Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, document how young witnesses incorporate interviewers' assumptions, how confidence can outstrip accuracy, and how repeated directive questions inflate error. Props make things worse, as reviews find anatomically detailed dolls and other interviewing aids can actually invite fantasy play and false reports rather than improve recall or touch events. Eventually, modern forensic protocols arose precisely to counter these problems. The NICHD Investigative Interview Protocol, for example, emphasizes open-ended prompts, minimal interviewer input, and careful pacing, which reliably increases the proportion of accurate, forensically useful details. Courts have also had to reckon with these limits. Professional bodies warned in the 1990s that so-called recovered memories retrieved in suggestive therapy could not be treated as inherently reliable, and urged extreme caution in criminal proceedings. Appellate reviews and daycare panic cases repeatedly flagged interviewing flaws such as repetitive leading questions and contamination from prior conversations, and in some jurisdictions, convictions were even overturned and compensation paid. In short, what looked like a hidden international network was often a network of ideas, suggestive training materials, professional seminars, and media narratives that primed investigators and therapists to expect the worst. The panic traveled quickly because the human mind wants sharp lines between us and them, and because memory under pressure can be made to serve the story. In the end, the Satanic Panic had no real victims of devil-worshipping, torture, and evil cult-like behavior. Instead, the victims were those who had been either coerced or accused. First is the obvious. People who had been accused of horrifying acts whilst being completely innocent. These people would have been vilified, abandoned, and treated terribly during this time, let alone the stress and horror of the situation. What that would do to a person's mental well-being, I hope to never find out. But then there are those who were actively convicted for the supposed crimes, such as the aforementioned West Memphis Three, or husband and wife Francis and Dan Keller, who ended up serving 21 of their 48-year sentence for abuses they allegedly committed at their Texas daycare. It wasn't until 2013 that the couple were finally released due to the lack of evidence and false medical testimony. But then, there are those that are forgotten in many stories surrounding the Satanic Panic. And that is those who were coerced to begin with. These were small children at the time who likely did not fully understand the repercussions of what they were saying. There are horrible things these children would have heard during the coercive interview tactics being used on them, not to mention the false memories that these children would now have, as many had been truly convinced that these were real-life memories. The trauma of a horrifying crime, alongside the guilt of knowing it was all made up, must be such a troubling and confusing thing to deal with. By the mid-90s, the Satanic Panic had settled, and much of the world moved on as if it had never happened. Generally, there was no moment of realization amongst the general public where they became aware of how easily they could be influenced. Instead, it fizzled out into nothing, only to rise up once again under new names within a couple of decades. With that in mind, we end where we began, with fear and misinformation. We can repeat the pattern, treating every rumor as a clue and every symbol as a confession. Or we can do what the Satanic Panic begged us not to do and insist on proof. Protect children with facts, not folklore. Hold institutions to account with evidence, not vibes. And remember that a movement can feel righteous and feel urgent and still be wrong.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Morgie. Co-edited by Sophie Tickle. Music by Billy Japp. With additional sounds from Storyblocks and Invato. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please like and review our show on your chosen podcast provider. This simple task is a big part of our show's continuation and growth. To access more chapters through our bonus material, early releases, ad-free content, and more, become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. To follow us on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, simply search Urban Legends Folklore or visit lukemordew.com/podcast. If you have more information or a correction on anything said, email us on luke@lukemordew.com. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority.
Thank you again, my spookies, for giving Luke Morgiou's podcast Urban Legends a good old Halloween listen. If you enjoyed what you heard, I recommend you go and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. I really do appreciate it. And a big thanks to Luke and the team at Urban Legends for supporting our program as well. So, until next time, stay spooky and always check your candy.